Hi everyone, I'm Susan Mulvihill and welcome back to my vegetable garden on this chilly, blustery day. I'm hoping the wind won't mess with the audio, but bear with me. So today I'm going to plant a bunch of cool season crops. I really need to get them in the ground, so that's why I'm putting up with this weather. I'm going to put in carrots, rutabagas for the first time ever, Swiss chard, and beets. I've got lots of tips to share with you, so come on along and we'll get started. This is the bed where I'm going to plant 4 rows of carrots and 1 row of rutabagas. You know, rutabaga is kind of a funny name. I have never grown them. I don't think I've ever even eaten any. But I thought, let's give them a try. I've heard they have a bit of a mustardy taste, and I thought, wouldn't they be great in stews this fall and winter? So yes, I definitely want to try them out. And a lot of times we think, oh, I'm not going to grow that because I don't think I'd like it. Well, you can spare a row in your garden to try something new this year, and who knows, maybe you'll think it's fantastic. So the first thing I did to this bed is I gently loosened the top couple of inches of soil. Ordinarily, I don't like to disturb the soil because it has such an important structure that the different types of organisms move about in. But in the case of planting seeds, I find that it's good to loosen the top couple of inches of soil to give them a good bed. One other thing I did, when I'm growing root crops, I always add in a little bit of bone meal to the soil. That's because bone meal is high in phosphorus. It's an organic soil amendment, and phosphorus promotes good root growth. And certainly root crops need all the help they can get so they can develop nice roots. So let's get started. I'm going to plant the rutabagas first, and they only need to be covered by 1/4 inch of soil. So I just made a shallow furrow using the end of my hoe. And they are going to be planted about 2 inches apart, and then once the seedlings are about 2 inches tall, you're going to thin them so that there's 6 inches between each plant. Thinning is a little tedious to do later, but it's so important because these guys need room to develop a nice root. If you don't thin them, you're going to have wimpy little rutabagas, and you don't want that. This is what the seeds look like. They're little black round seeds. And you won't be able to see me dropping these black seeds onto our dark brown soil. But I'm trying to space them about 2 inches apart. Once you have all the seeds planted, just knock a little bit of soil over the seeds. Again, you want just about 1/4 inch of soil, and then pat them down with your hand so that the seeds make good contact with the soil. And after you've done that, make sure you label the row so that you remember what you planted. For planting carrots, it's the same concept. I'm just using the end of my hoe to make a furrow. The interesting thing is that carrot seeds only need to be covered by 1/8 of an inch of soil. So they just barely need to be covered. This year I'm growing 2 types of carrots. One is Scarlet Nantes and the other is Starica. And when you're planting the seeds, you can plant them fairly thickly because they are a little slow and spotty to germinate at times. But the other thing is, just like with the rutabagas, you absolutely must thin the seedlings. Once they're a couple of inches tall, what you want to do is thin them to about 3 inches apart. It's the same thing. If they do not have room to develop good roots, you're going to have wimpy little carrots and be disappointed. So remember, you absolutely have to thin them. Once you've planted all of your seeds, just knock a little bit of soil on top of them. And remember to pat them in again so that the seeds and soil make good contact with each other. And don't forget to label your plantings, especially when you're growing more than one variety. And that's because you might want to evaluate later which one did better, which one do we like more. And if you don't label them, you're not going to remember what's what. The next step is to water your seeds in well. For one thing, moisture is very important for germination or sprouting of the seeds. But the other thing is that by watering them in, they really make good contact with the soil. As I mentioned earlier, carrots can be very slow to germinate, and a lot of times they just plain don't germinate at all. And that can be really frustrating because you really want to get your money's worth as far as the seeds you plant. Well, I learned a really cool tip from a fellow master gardener a few years ago. I've been using it ever since, and it works great. The problem in the spring is that we get such wild swings in the weather. It'll be really dry for a while, then we'll have a downpour, and then it'll dry out again. And what happens with those swings in the weather is that the surface of the soil forms a crust. Well, carrot seedlings are very wimpy, and they have a hard time pushing through that crust on the soil. So what my friend Rhonda taught me many years ago is that once you have planted the seeds and watered them in, if you cover your rows of seeds with boards, and just use ones you have laying around, and just cover them, you keep the boards on for about a week to 10 days. Then you take them off, and what happens is the boards are preventing that crust from forming on the surface of the soil. The seeds will start germinating. You'll get better germination than ever, and it works great. Now I realize it's not going to look real pretty here for a week to 10 days, but I'm okay with that because I want as many seeds to germinate as possible. Now, like I was saying, this is not pretty, but I don't care because this works so well. The next crops I'm going to plant are beets and Swiss chard. Both of these are members of the beet family, which is probably not a big surprise, and spinach also belongs to the same plant family. Because of this, they need special handling once the seeds have been planted, and I'll explain that in a few moments. I'm going to grow ruby red Swiss chard, and if you ever look at the seeds for chard or beets, you'll notice that they're kind of a conglomeration of more than one seed stuck together. And you don't need to worry about separating them or thinning them, you just plant them and go. I'm going to sow the seeds about 6 inches apart because they're going to be really nice plants. And if you've never had Swiss chard, you definitely should try it. It's delicious, especially if you steam it and then add some sauteed onions to it and a splash of vinegar. Yum. They also are great in soups. These seeds get covered with a 1/2 inch of soil. And then remember to pat them in for good contact. I'm growing 2 types of beets this year. One is Chioggia. It's one that's been around for a while. It has a striped root, and I thought they would look really cool. Then the other type is a tried and true one that I've been growing for years called Cylindra. Sometimes it's called cylindrical, and it's referring to the bulb. It is very cylindrical. They are so productive and so tasty, and they keep really well. So I definitely wanted to grow them as well. The seeds get planted 1/2 inch deep, and I typically will plant them about 2 inches apart. But once the seedlings are up a couple of inches, I'll thin them to a 4-inch spacing. The next step is to water in your seeds, which is something you should always do. And when you're planting seedlings, it's so important to water them in because it's one of the things that will minimize transplant shock. I mentioned earlier that beets, spinach, and Swiss chard are members of the beet family and that they require special handling after the seeds have been planted. So I wanted to explain why. Each of those crops are very susceptible to an insect called the leaf miner. The adult is a fly that lands on the leaves of those plants, lays eggs, the eggs hatch into little maggots, and those tunnel throughout the leaves, and they can ruin an entire planting in nothing flat. It's awful. Well, the easiest solution to this, that is organic and very straightforward, is that you use a sheet of floating row cover, you cover the planting, we put them on hoops, and it acts as a physical barrier to keep that adult fly away from those plants. Now, the thing is, you want to use it as soon as you plant your seeds, and then you can leave the plants covered for the entire season, except for harvesting, of course, because none of these crops needs to be pollinated by bees, so they don't need access to them. Now, first of all, I had someone ask me recently what we use for our hoops. We had a bunch of leftover old drip irrigation tubing. It's 1/2 inch in diameter, and that's what we put into these PVC uprights for our hoops. But you don't have to use something like that. You might consider using PVC pipe that's narrow enough in diameter so it's very flexible. You could use rebar that has been bent into the shape of a hoop, or you could use electrical conduit, which is a metal that could also be bent into the shape of a hoop. Now let me show you what floating row cover looks like. This is what floating row cover looks like. It's a lightweight fabric that is porous, so it allows sunlight and moisture to get through it. It's easy to find at large, well-stocked garden centers and online in all kinds of sizes. This is my very best tool for organic insect control because I do not have to use any chemicals at all, which is awesome. Now, I don't have very many damaging insects in my garden, but leaf miners are right at the top of the list of bad guys. So all I do is I use this as a physical barrier to keep those adult leaf miner flies away from the plants, and I will end up with perfect produce. So I just love that. Now you can also use floating row cover as a season extender early in the season and late in the season because it provides plants with a few degrees of frost protection. Now we've been having a windstorm today, which underscores the importance of putting down bricks or blocks of wood or something to weight down the edges, because obviously if this blows off, it's not protecting your plants at all. I highly recommend floating row cover because it is awesome and it really makes my job so much easier. Well, now you know all about planting carrots, rutabagas, beets, Swiss chard, and spinach. I hope this was helpful today. If you have any questions, just drop me an email at susan@susansinthegarden.com. Happy gardening!